Direction point! Direction point!
A Doctor Who podcast network.
Well, hi everybody. Welcome back to Doctor Who Literature, the podcast taking you through the world of the Doctor Who novelizations put out by Target Books from 1973 onward in publication order. We're a member of the Direction Point Doctor Who podcast network. My name is Jason, and I'm your host on this journey, this very long journey. Welcome back to the Target novelizations. November 2023 is over, and Doctor Who's 60th anniversary month is over. I had a great time over the last 4 weeks, bringing you 4 action-packed anniversary episodes with some amazing guests. New York Times best-selling author Adam Christopher, who got his start in Doctor Who fandom, Gary Russell and Mickey Lewis, Doctor Who novelists, who came to me from Li Who in August 2023, Sean Lyon, the frontman of the Gallifrey 1 convention, who I'll be seeing in Los Angeles in a few months, discussing his top 60 stories, and then Paul Hayes, author of Pull to Open, the new book from 10 Acre Films about the creation of Doctor Who in 1962 and 1963, and of course last week's mini reviews of The Star Beast from friends of the show, Jan Fennick, and co-producer Jim Sangster. Now we are back on track with Target book number 96, the July 1985 release, The Mind of Evil. This book means a lot to me, so since Doctor Who is already back on the air, and I am recording this at the end of the same day when Wild Blue Yonder premiered both in the UK and around the world on Disney+, I will reserve my discussion and judgment of Wild Blue Yonder for a Trap 1 episode that I'm going to be recording on Sunday, the day after Wild Blue Yonder premiered. So I will spare you my thoughts on that and direct you over to Trap 1, where I can be found so frequently. But for now, let's welcome back to the show co-producer Jim Sangster. We are going to discuss The Mind of Evil, and boy, do we have a lot to say. Let's get to it.
You are invited on an adventure across all of time and space, in a completely random order. It's the Police Box in the Junkyard podcast. Jump in the TARDIS with your hosts,
Eric Gulbranson,
Asad Kheshki,
and
Matthew Kressel.
Explore Doctor Who TV stories, audio adventures, and books, both novels and non-fiction. The Police Box in the Junkyard podcast. It's the entire Whoniverse on shuffle. The Police Box in the Junkyard podcast is a member of the Direction Point network and is available about once a month wherever you find your podcasts. You are listening to the Doctor Who Literature podcast.
So welcome to the special Halloween episode of Doctor Who Literature, and I am wearing my Jason Friday the 13th t-shirt. Jim Sangster, welcome back to the show. What are you wearing?
I haven't thought this through. I'm wearing a Target logo, which I think probably just makes me a big target. So, yeah, I've got my traditional 3-color Target logo t-shirt.
You would be thematic for any other episode recording, but even though this episode is being released the Sunday after Halloween, so I guess technically The Awakening should have been my Halloween episode, but I recorded it too far in advance and I wasn't thinking it through. This is the last episode that I am recording this on the Sunday before October the 31st, so this is our Halloween episode. But that's what I wanted to talk to you about, because you have been on Twitter you call it Shocktober, which I love, by the way. Then you have been very, very industrious with Halloween movies and Halloween design. Walk us through that.
Well, last year I started. Actually, I'm Oktoberfest. That's my little phrase, yeah, Oktoberfest. But it's because I got the wrong hashtag, and everyone else has been doing Shocktober. So last year I did a load of really big hitters. Like I did all of Friday the 13th, the original run of Friday the 13th. And I did some really huge 80s movies that I'd never seen before. And I watched about 40 or so. This year I stumbled a bit at the beginning because my headspace was a bit wrecked because of various things. So anyway, I've done about 20 movies so far. So I've got 10 to do in the next few days. And I'm going out tonight, so there's not going to be any movies tonight. But because I did all the good ones, I'm really going through a lot of the dregs. So I watched the new prequel to Pet Sematary called Pet Sematary Bloodlines, which was pointless. I just when you're watching a movie which is supposed to be a prequel to a beloved horror classic, and they seem to be getting basic characters wrong, and the timescale is wrong, and I just didn't see the point of it. So that was infuriating.
I have to ask. I have not seen that yet. It is free on one of my streaming services, but I haven't seen it. Is this authorized or plotted by Stephen King, or did he just sell the rights to somebody for $1, and they made their own out there prequel that he didn't have any authorization into?
I don't think it's done with any collaboration with Stephen King, but as he often has said, the benefit of letting people do their own thing is if it's great, well, he inspired it. If it sucks, well, he had nothing to do with it. So I think this is the latter.
Does it have any characters in common? So Fred Gwynn's character or the Creed family?
Yeah, so Fred Quinn's character from the or John Lithgow's character from the remake, it just doesn't work, and I don't really see the point of it, and it doesn't really add much to it apart from everything we already know. But it then undermines everything we already know by just throwing in quite a boring story. To be honest with you, it's just not at all engaging. And I saw Hannibal Rising, going through a lot of prequels. That was pointless as well. Another film where they don't seem to understand the character, who he's going to become, and so they just it's rubbish. But I've seen some ones that surprised me, and one of the ones that surprised me was the remake of Friday the 13th, the 2009 remake, because the first, like the pre-title sequence, is a kind of summary of the end of the first Friday the 13th. Then they have a load of campers sitting around a fire, and it's a bit like the beginning of Friday the 13th Part 3. And then they end up kind of remaking Friday the 13th Part 4. But it's got some inventive kills. It's got it's tense all the way through. It's not as gory as the original ones, but considering it's a remake of a classic, it's also it could also fit into the timeline at any point. So it's as repetitive as a lot of the other ones, and it's as faithful to the story as it can be. And because it's also a told story, it's like folklore. They're all sitting around at a fire telling each other the story. It feels authentic. It feels like it's probably like in the top 4 Friday the 13th for me. So I really enjoyed that.
So let me back up then and ask some questions. Hannibal Rising, I read the book. I think that was the Thomas Harris book from about 20 years ago. And that was Lecter Castle, a terrible tragedy happens. Hannibal then moves into the world and begins his very, very young career as a serial killer. I have no recollection of the movie at all. Who was in the movie?
I think Rhys Evans is in it he's not quite a Nazi. He's a freelancer who has been working for the Germans. Denis Ménochet, the French actor from the beginning of Inglourious Bastards, is in far too briefly. Other than that, it's not really got a starry cast at all. There's no one sort of distractingly famous in it. And I'm also blanking on the actor who plays young Hannibal, but it's kind of, they forget that Hannibal is incredibly charming. And a lot of the things that I think it must be Thomas Harris's fault, because I think it sticks to the book quite faithfully, possibly. But a lot of the stuff that happens in his life seemed to be coincidental. It's a bit like one of the criticisms they had for Solo, where everything significant that happens is only significant because it happened in Star Wars later on. So, there's a lot of things that come into it that, like he gets a stepmother who is an expert in martial arts, and she teaches him martial arts and gives him a special sword that he uses for the killings, and it's just a bit contrived. It's a bit boring. I love that. I mean, I did enjoy Solo. I really enjoyed it. I would love a second one. I would love them to do a Solo heist movie, a bit like The Italian Job or something like that, because I would love to see him working for Jabba the Hutt, because Jabba the Hutt is my favourite movie monster of all time. So long as they don't do him in CGI. It's got to be a big lump of rubber.
I want the Declan Mulholland. In my headcanon, Declan Mulholland is the only. Because when I had the original Roy Thomas penned New Hope comic, 6 issues from Marvel, 1976 and 77, it was Declan Mulholland's body, and then it was a monster mask where his face would have been, which was the original plan. It was not a CGI slug. But once I saw Declan Mulholland from the Sea Devils, from the Androids of Tara, walking around in a fur coat going, Han, me boy. Like, that's my Jabba the Hutt.
With a beautiful Northern Irish accent as well.
Exactly. I want the charming. That's the one that I want. The charming Irish Jabba the Hutt rogue. And that's why Han says, Jabba, you're a wonderful human. Because he was talking to Declan Mulholland.
Yeah. So yeah, the other good from the 80s, Terror Train, which is basically Jamie Lee Curtis has done Halloween, and someone wants to do another kind of Halloween, so they got a slasher stalker, but it's on a train. And
is this before or after Trading Places, which is where Jamie Lee Curtis went into the mainstream?
Before. So this is 1980. It's like literally 2 years after Halloween. And because I saw Maniac Cop last year, I saw Maniac Cop 2, and the whole premise is ridiculous, but the stunts are fantastic. It's really, really tense. And what was the other one? Oh, yeah. So I watched the Spanish language werewolf movie, Lobos de Aga. The English title is Game of Werewolves. I think they're playing on Game of Thrones. It's kind of like a werewolf Spanish Shaun of the Dead. It's funny. The characters are really engaging. The werewolves are great. It adds something to the lore. Really enjoyed it. And then last week I saw Exorcist Believer.
I've said this before and I'll say it again. It is not an Exorcist movie if it doesn't have Jason Miller in it.
Well, Exorcist 3 is my favorite horror movie of all time. George C. Scott as Kinderman is one of my favorite movie detectives of all time. This is not anywhere near as good as that one or the original Exorcist, but the fact that every other Exorcist sequel or prequel is trash means that this can easily slide in as a very distant third best Exorcist movie without actually praising it. So
the great thing about the original Friday the 13th is that it is basically a shot-for-shot remake of Psycho. Harry Manfredini's score for the original Friday is basically Bernard Herrmann's score from Psycho, but the notes are rearranged just enough so they couldn't actually file a copyright claim. And you have who seems to be the main character who's killed off in the second reel, and then everything shifts to a second final girl. And then you have a shower murder, and then there's a really big jump scare at the end. Friday the 13th Part 2 is where they start to develop the mythology, and that's, of course, where things start to go off the rails for me, because what happens to Jason in Part 2 makes absolutely no sense. That he is a feral, mute creature living off the grid who was able to find and stalk the final girl from the first movie in a different neighborhood, sever her phone line when he shouldn't know what a telephone is, and then murder her in creative ways before going back to the camp and doing it all over again. Anyway, is there any Psycho reference in the Friday the 13th remake, which is already 15 years old, and yet I've never seen it?
I mean, only because it's Psycho's the granddaddy of slasher, even though there's only 2 murders in the original Psycho. And bear in mind, I'm very forgiving for the remake of Gus Van Sant's remake, because I love his reasoning for doing a shot-for-shot remake, which is basically Hitchcock himself did a virtual shot-for-shot remake of one of his own films, and he also remade a lot of his films. You know, he did the 39 Steps and then remade it a lot. So Gus Van Sant was getting death threats, and he went, right, Sodja, I'm going to be so slavishly honouring the original, I'm going to do shot-for-shot. And then when he started getting death threats, he thought, the only ones I'm going to mess with are the murder scenes. So I'm going to throw some extra subliminal shots in there just to really mess with it. I thought I'd love to see every generation someone go, I'm going to do a shot-for-shot remake and just treat it like a stage play where you just recast it. I'd love to do that. The problem with that remake, though, is that the casting is I think, really bad. I think there's some really bad problems with the casting in that.
I thought Vince Vaughn was not playing anywhere close to what Anthony Perkins was playing. And I could understand why you would not want to just do an Anthony Perkins imitation. But I thought Vince Vaughn gave the entirely wrong vibe, which didn't quite fit. the character. But who am I to judge acting performances?
I watched the remake of Psycho in a cinema off Times Square. It's the only time I've been to New York. It was getting to New Year's Eve, 1989, and me and my late friend Paul decided that we needed to see Psycho. And some of the youths in the theatre were not impressed by certain things that Vince Vaughn was doing while peeping through the hole in the wall. And that was when they got up and started shouting. I think they'd heard what the plot might have been, and so they got up and started shouting, "The killer's his mother!" and then got out, and which we thought was hilarious.
This is nominally a family show, so we're not going to talk about what Vince Vaughn was doing while looking through the peephole. I just want to figure out which theater this was. At the moment, and this is of course 25 years on, there are two theaters on 42nd Street, west of Times Square, between 7th Avenue and 8th Avenue. They're both 25-screen multiplexes, and they're directly across the street from one another. So there's the Regal Ewok and there's the AMC Empire. They both have 25 screens.
So what was that first one? There's not a cinema called the Regal Ewok. You're kidding me.
Ewok.
Okay.
E-W-A-L-K.
I thought they've named a cinema after Chief Chirper. Are you kidding me?
But I was not living it. I didn't move back to New York until early 99. I spent the better part of the 90s in Baltimore and then Toledo, Ohio. And I didn't start spending a lot of time in Manhattan until 2001 when I started moving into the city. So I don't know when those theaters opened, but you may have, if they were huge 25-screen multiplexes, my guess is you would have seen the Psycho remake in one of those two enormous theaters, except there may have been some small hole-in-the-wall theater that is now long since defunct and torn down and replaced with a chain restaurant.
In my mind, it was maybe a block or two away from Yoko Ono's War Is Over sign. It was bitterly cold. I've never been so cold in my life, and one of the reasons why we decided to go into a cinema was just because it was so cold. So I know we didn't walk that far. I also know it's not one of those type of cinemas that Travis Bickle took Betsy to in Taxi Driver. So
Poor Sybil Shepherd.
Anyway.
So, other than our respective Halloween marathons, my daughter and I have watched all 6 Scream movies in the same month. Every Scream movie contrives to have the same Hitchcock shot of the camera pointing up at the shower head as the water turns on. But I was discussing this with you very early in our 6-movie marathon, and you said, what did you say about the Scream movies? They're all...
Well, it was the third one when they're running around, and I suddenly realised, oh, Scream is just Tom and Jerry. It's Tom and Jerry with blood. And that was when I suddenly thought, oh, I've been taking this far too seriously. I often do this with horrific movies. When I watched Starship Troopers, I got increasingly angry at how right-wing and fascistic it was, completely missing the fact that it's a satire. And it's only when Doogie Howser comes back at the very, very end that I suddenly went, oh, this is supposed to be funny. And speaking of Doogie Howser, he's going to be on our screens very soon in Doctor Who, isn't he?
And there will be a novelization. So somewhere we'll be discussing how Doogie Howser is written in a Doctor Who novelization.
That's going to be great. I can't wait. I'm actually looking forward to new Doctor Who. It's going to be great.
It is amazing that Neil Patrick Harris has had this incredible protean career that is now spanning literally 35 years. In my mind, he is always only going to be Doogie, because that was the first show that I saw him, and that was the show that spoke to me more than any other sitcom in the late 1980s. The other seminal moment from late 1980s sitcoms was on a show called Growing Pains, which ran for 7 years. But there was a plot line on Growing Pains involving the middle child, the daughter Carol, played by Tracy Gold. There was a 4-episode arc in the middle of the series where she starts dating a college student who, in his last episode, is involved in a drunk driving accident, goes to the hospital, recovers, and then dies off-screen of internal bleeding. But the college student who dies in a tragic drunk driving collision is Matthew Perry. who then later got his own very long-running sitcom and only just passed away not even 24 hours ago as you and I are talking.
Yeah, and as I said on Twitter this morning, it's very strange when someone you've never met dies and you suddenly realise that you owe them so much, because when Virgin Books were doing Doctor Who, and then they started doing program guides, and they started knocking out program guides to every single one of the big sci-fi properties that they could get their hands on. And my friends were big fans of Friends, and so I did a book proposal with a friend, David Bailey, and we treated Friends as if it were Doctor Who or Star Trek, and we got a commission. So we did an unofficial program guide to Friends called Friends Like Us, and that was my first professional writing job.
Oh, wow.
And off the back of that, Peter Darvill Evans was an amazing sponsor to us, and he said, "What have you got next?" And I said, "I'd like to do a book on Hitchcock." And I got my friend Paul to co-write that with me, and we had the idea of doing it as a pocketbook, a bit like the Discontinuity Guide. And he went, "No, I want to go big on this." So we got, I think it was a Royale format, so it's a large format book. We got a photo section in the middle, and we were the first of the Virgin film guides, the film series that came out. And then off the back of that, I did another one on Scorsese. And then that was then a calling card to other companies who were looking for writers for hire to do. So I did a book on 24 and a book on Spooks, which in the States is MI5.
Yes.
And it all started from just realizing that there was a niche, there was a gap in the market, because people were looking at Friends and it was very quotable, and they were buying merchandise, and they were treating it like we've traditionally seen sci-fi shows done. And I started watching Friends because Matthew Perry was just so charismatic and funny, and I found that the episodes I was watching, his dialogue started appearing in my real life. So I suppose in some quite significant way, he helped my writing career, because he inspired me to pitch to do a TV show guide that no one else was thinking of. Yeah, so, and that's also someone who's only a couple of years older than me. When you become aware of your own mortality, it's quite frightening. You know, people in our own kind of ballpark of your own generation. It's just quite upsetting, really.
And the circumstances of his death are not fully explained yet. It's not even been 24 hours, but he apparently went into cardiac arrest and drowned in a jacuzzi, which is, I mean, he's only 54 years old, and 30 years ago that would have seemed ancient to me, but 54 now, that's months away for us.
It's terrifyingly close. And of course, you've already got the ghouls out saying, "Oh, maybe it was COVID vaccine." It's like, oh, really? Anyway, they just get me angry. Let's talk about Doctor Who. That'll cheer me up.
I could talk about the anti-vaxxers for a very, very long time, but considering that growing up in a Jewish household, Dr. Jonas Salk was one of the absolute idols of our family. I was raised that vaccines were a public good, and now vaccines have become a public evil, and I don't understand how the world has changed so much. But you would have to have a mind of evil to spread that kind of nonsense. So let's segue to talk about an actual mind of evil.
I have seen blunt implements shoved into bodies in horror movies that were less...
To quote Hannibal Lecter, the ham-handed segue.
That was beautiful. Well done. Yeah, Mind of Evil.
The Mind of Evil that exists now, and you can watch it on the Blu-ray Season 8 collection, is a gorgeous restoration. But you and I, being old school fans, you and I don't quite recall watching Mind of Evil in gorgeous, full-color, high definition.
Well, this is my dilemma, because Mind of Evil was never repeated. The original tapes were wiped in the 1970s. So, as you say, what we've got is a reconstruction. It's one that uses black and white film and a color recovery program. but it's not the real original broadcast, is it? It's not remotely that. So can any of us actually say we've actually seen The Mind of Evil?
Mind of Evil came out in your birth year. There was no chance of you watching it embryonically while being.
Well, this is my birth story. This is the story. I was born February the 1st, 1971, and when I was thinking about this show, and I thought, it just suddenly struck me, I've never actually seen. This is a reconstruction. It's not the real Mind of Evil. When Doctor Who Monthly released that winter special in 1981 about the archives, and it listed all the episodes that were missing. And I think for a lot of people of my generation, it would have been the first time we became aware that the BBC didn't actually own everything. Even if we didn't expect to see these episodes ever again, because in those days the BBC didn't do repeats out of time until The Five Faces was the first one. So what was really shocking was we knew that there might be some black and white things missing, maybe because they're old. But John Pertwee's not old. I remember the very end of John Pertwee. My earliest memory is Planet of the Spiders, the Christmas repeat. And so technically this is a missing story because we don't have the original tapes. But what we do have is a reconstruction that feels authentic. There's enough there, even though it's as authentic as a telestamp reconstruction. It feels authentic because there's nothing actually missing. Even though it's been faked. It's been faked. It's not real.
So you have these BBC Enterprises film transfers, a film camera pointed at a video monitor, and that has a different texture and a different grain. That is then restored via a computer program called Vidfire to resemble the original 625 line videotape look. And then using chroma dots on the black and white film camera aimed at a color screen, you can unpick the colors and colorize the restored video. I imagine the soundtrack also would have been heavily remastered, because when you're pointing a film camera at a TV screen in 1971, you're not going to have stereophonic sound. So every element of Mind of Evil has been restored or preserved or reconstructed in some way.
And episode 1 is hand painted as well, isn't it, by Babel Colour?
That's right.
So even that, it exists because of fan love. It doesn't exist because of good archiving.
I have made this comment before, and it is obligatory on Doctor Who literature that I have to reference baseball in every single episode. So that is going to be the reference for this week. For a while, you were able to purchase entire World Series on DVD. Major League Baseball was selling these about 20 years ago. So they would take that year's World Series and release it on like an 8-disc box set. Every game had its own disc and sleeve. And they were also selling the classic World Series of years past. So you could buy the 1975 World Series, which is generally believed to be the greatest ever. 1991, which is also generally believed to be the greatest ever. 1986, which is pretty much the consensus third or fourth choice for greatest World Series of all time. Also 1977, when the Yankees played the Los Angeles Dodgers. I've mentioned that on this show several times. But when they're taking videotape from 1977, they are not restoring it. When Game 7 of the 1960 World Series was discovered as a kinescope, film transfers in Bing Crosby's wine cellar decades after Bing Crosby died, when the executor of his estate was going through his inventory to see what was there, and discovered this classic World Series game that was thought to be missing and lost forever decades ago. They took this kinescope black and white footage shot off of a color TV screen when Bing was overseas, and they released it as a DVD. But they didn't do the Vidfire restoration. They did not reconvert it to the original video look. They didn't take the chroma dots, and they didn't try to colorize it. All it is a really bad kinescope of a baseball game that is now 63 years old with a shocking conclusion. You could take these videotapes and restore them the way that Doctor Who fans have restored them. When you watch Sontaran Experiment, which is a fair to middling story, if that, and it's a trifle, and it's only 2 episodes long. When you look at the Blu-ray release of that, it looks as if it was shot yesterday. That is how incredibly clean the video is. Baseball isn't doing that. They are releasing these videotapes as they were, and they're grainy, and there's dropouts, and they're blurry. And in the case of Game 7 of the 1960 World Series, all it is a black and white kinescope with 0 efforts at restoration whatsoever. Doctor Who fandom is doing wonderful things for us. Literally, billion-dollar enterprises cannot be bothered to do for their own property.
The fact that when I used to work on the BBC Archive website, and we got to know a lot of the people who work in the archive, and we got a tour of the actual physical archives, and we were shown one room where, as soon as they open the door, the first thing you notice is the stench of vinegar.
Ooh.
And basically, this is an isolation room where if they've got anything that's been hit with vinegar syndrome, they need to start trying to convert it to a more stable format now, because otherwise that's lost forever. And we're always reminded, we get very upset about things that are missing from the archives, but we're always reminded everything that exists in the archives is a blessing. It's incredibly amazing that so much of this survives. And only this week, there's a group of people who are always hunting for missing stuff, not just Doctor Who, but loads of stuff. And they've recently recovered, I think, three episodes of 1960s sitcoms that were lost, an episode of the Tom Jones Show, and then a film from 1919.
Oh, wow.
And they found it on film. And that is just ridiculous that it survived all this time. So, like every fan, I moan about the fact that we haven't got every story that exists. I also moan about the fact that there's so much of shows like Callan and the Avengers that are missing. But there's so much that we have got. And this is like a beautiful example of we don't have the original tapes anymore. But what we have got is enough to reconstruct it in a way that you might think the colour looks a bit fuzzy. It might look a bit like an NTSC conversion or something. But it's enough where you can watch it, and within 5 minutes you've forgotten that you're not watching the authentic original tapes. You're just watching what I think is a really good Doctor Who story.
I famously started keeping my off-air collection of Doctor Who VHS tapes in 1990. And I started in super long play mode on a 6-hour cassette. I taped all 7 episodes of The Ambassadors of Death and all 7 episodes of Inferno. That was my first tape, and I labeled it Best of Doctor Who Volume 1. My second cassette was parts 1 through 4 of Terror of the Autons, parts 1 through 6 of Colony in Space, and then parts 1, 2, and 3 of The Demons, which I then finished on a different cassette, which I later rounded out with Curse of Pelanon, etc. I was not keeping every story because I was making $4.25 an hour at my job, and I couldn't afford an unlimited supply of tapes.
See, you could have worked in the BBC Archive with a philosophy like that.
But what you've just heard me say is that when I was curating which stories to go into my best of collection, Mind of Evil wasn't on it. And I cannot duplicate what train of thought led me to not save Mind of Evil. I think the answer that I've come up with is this. I came through almost all of the Pertwees via the novelization first, because I bought The Demons very early on. That was my second week of buying Target novelizations, and I fell in love with the Pertwee era because of The Demons novelization. Mind of Evil comes out in 1985, and I'll do my audio essay and address more of this after the recording. The Mind of Evil novelization is, I think, the literal bit. It's the moment when the Pertwee era goes from archival to Doctor Who's golden age. Yes, Pertwee was the Doctor for longer than anybody up to that point. Yes, Barry Letts and Terrance Dicks were gods among men when it comes to the production of Doctor Who. Yes, the Pertwee era was beloved as it was on and had super ratings, and the novelizations have become an ongoing enterprise during and because of the Pertwee years. And I think the first 6 novelizations were all Pertwees, but things change. Mind of Evil, the book, comes out in 1985. John Pertwee has not been the Doctor now for a dozen years. People who are reading the Target novelizations in 1985 are my age. They're either reading in a different country that hasn't gotten the Pertwee package in syndication yet, or they're young British fans who barely remember the Pertwee era, if at all. This is the first new novelization that has the Doctor, and Joe, and Unit, and Roger Delgado. The best ever collection of cast that Doctor Who ever had in its first several decades. The Doctor, and Joe, and the Brigadier, and Benton, and Yates, and Corporal Bell, and Roger Delgado. This is the first book that comes out in our fandom memory that puts all these people on the same page. And it's Terrance Dicks. This is not a 110-page Destiny of the Daleks rushed to print to match the air date. This is not a 100-page adaptation of Robots of Death because he was writing 10 books that year and didn't have time to give it atmosphere. This is Terrance writing a book that starts on page 7, goes to page 144, is dense small print, and has myth-making on every page. This book is so transcendently good that the TV footage has no hope of catching up. I think my receipt of the video of Mind of Evil must have been disappointment and shock that it wasn't as good as the novelization. Because I had built it up in my head as this epic piece of cinema, and instead I was just watching 6 weeks of a video that got Tim Coombe fired for not getting enough reaction shots. I have come the long way around on this. Whatever disappointment I would have had in 1990 that caused me to tape Mind of Evil and then erase it, I don't have that anymore. I think this is one of Doctor Who's finest hours.
I mean, firstly, that's criminal. Secondly, I think Mind of Evil is a bit like Enemy of the World. When you've got monster seasons, and the fans always go, oh, the monster seasons, you've got this monster and that monster. And then all the way through that season, you've also got the Master as well. It's quite underwhelming if you're a kid and you're just looking for all of the monsters, and what you get is this thing on a serving trolley. But I think a lot of fans, when they get their second wind and they go back and watch a show like Mind of Evil, they desperately want it to be gritty because it's set in a prison. And it's dealing with grown-up concerns like peace conferences and impending war, which feels quite prescient. Well, it feels quite pressing right now because we've kind of got the same situation. It feels like we're on the verge of a war on many fronts in our world right now. And it's simple things like you've got a Doctor Who story where they've got brickwork. The sets are replicating the cold grey of a prison brick wall.
Right.
And it feels authentic again. And there's that word again. It feels authentic, and it feels like the sort of show that when you're a teenager, you wish Doctor Who was like all the time because it feels gritty and it's got men who shout and look really scary, and the threats of violence, and it's got guns. But I think once you've got past that phase, then you can just appreciate it for. I think it's really well acted. It's got some great characters in it. It's got some unfortunate bits as well. The repetition of the phrase "a Chinese girl" it becomes a bit comical. It's like in a city like London, which has got one of the biggest Chinese populations in Europe. Unless you're in Doctor Who, in which case there are no Chinese people. So the novelty of having two in one story is amazing. But the basic thing I get with Mind of Evil is just it feels like the sort of show that if you're a teenager or an early 20s fan, it's the show you wish it was like most of the time.
The story has two prominent speaking roles for Chinese actors. Don Houghton and Pixel and Lim have a daughter, Sarah, who almost 40 years later returns as an actor to the Doctor Who universe and has a prominent role in a two-part Sarah Jane Adventures story. That's wonderful. I mean, you're not getting that sort of story or connection out of John Bennett wearing unfortunate latex appliances in Talons of Weng Chiang. This is at least Doctor Who trying to give equitable representation, because John Pertwee's Doctor, as it turns out, speaks a fluent Chinese dialect. name drops Chairman Mao, and becomes genuine friends with the Chinese ambassador to the peace conference. This is much better than the Troughton years when a diverse crew meant one British, one Swedish, one Norwegian, one Frenchman, and then one non-speaking black character in the background. This is Doctor Who trying to be truly international. And there's a caricature of an American, unfortunately, but that's not the only Doctor Who story to caricature the American. I think it almost works.
Are you saying he's not an authentic American?
I'm saying it is not an authentic American.
But I mean, we've also got the strong, silent Afro-Caribbean character that plagues a lot of these stories. You know, he's got nothing to say. He's just there to look strong and moody. Terence does make a rather unfortunate comparison between him saying it's something like he's as black and strong as the car he was driving, which it feels a bit awkward. But I was thinking about this as well, because obviously you've just recently done Marco Polo, and you alluded to the fine theatrical tradition of white people playing different ethnicities. You know, it was very common when I was growing up, and I think people, certainly of my generation, are a lot more willing to just accept it as a fact, and not be quite so upset about things like Townsville and Chiang. And yet,
there was a period of time where Jewish actors were considered ethnic, and they were cast to play the Asian roles. You see that in Doctor Who in the 1960s. I mentioned 3 Jewish cast members playing Asian characters in Marco Polo, and it happens again with Padma Samava, Wolf Morris, whose real name was not Wolf Morris, in The Abominable Snowmen. It happens in America too, where Jewish actor Paul Muni plays the Chinese character lead in the movie adaptation of Pearl S. Buck's The Good Earth, which is, Pearl S. Buck was an American. She was the daughter of missionaries, but she grew up in China, and she wrote several novels about the Chinese experience throughout the 20th century. And The Good Earth is a very good book, but Paul Muni is playing the lead, not a Chinese actor, because in the 1930s, a Jewish actor was considered to be other or foreign. So that's the one that they cast. Paul Muni later comes to Brooklyn in the late 1950s and films a movie called The Last Angry Man, and he offers my grandmother a role as an extra, playing a Jewish mother lighting Shabbos candles in the background. My grandmother, an immigrant, declined. I presume she didn't want to be typecast. But I have a family. I have a very distant and tenuous family connection to this. The fact that you have Christopher Cobb and Pik Sen Lim, not only is it earth-shattering for Doctor Who, but it was almost an anomaly, because when Talons is made, they're not doing that. They're going back to a couple of non-speaking Chinese extras, and then John Bennett in bad makeup.
at least the part here, Christopher Cum is not a major role, but it's a significant role for that episode, and he's afforded a lot of dignity and respect from the Doctor. One of the films I was watching in my horror run is a 1964 film starring Tony Randall, The Seven Faces of Dr. Lowe. And in that, Tony Randall plays a Chinese mystic, playing up on every single stereotype with all of the... I'm not going to do the accent. The whole point of it is he plays 7 different characters through the whole film. And you never quite know if it's just they look all a bit like Tony Randall, or if it's the one character playing all of the others. So again, there's a sense of it doesn't really matter if he's an authentic Chinese character, because none of his characters are authentic. He's not an ancient Greek. He's not Medusa. He's not Pan. So it's all a bit of a fantasy. But I think that would still make people very concerned because of the choices he makes in the early part of the movie. But at least here, you've got, okay, I think one's Malaysian and one's from Singapore, but you've got people who feel like authentic Chinese characters. You've got the Doctor making a nice attempt at completely sabotaging Hokkien. But yeah, I think it's possibly just because you've got a writer who's just a little bit more sensitive to the production, and maybe he's influencing the production team to go, look, I can get you at least one decent actor. And apparently the reason why they got Christopher Cum is because the actor that they cast was terrible, and he ran the agency and he went, I could do it.
Christopher Cum, I don't think was ever in Doctor Who again, was he?
No. He had quite a few appearances in loads of different shows, often as Chinese waiters, unfortunately.
I want to make sure that I get it right. And in the interest of getting it right, I will point out that Tony Randall's real name was Leonard Rosenberg, which builds onto my theme earlier.
It's funny with Pixem Lim as well, because she, like from her parents' generation, she would be famous from Emergency Ward 10. She was, if not the first Chinese actress on British TV to have a big starring role. She was one of the first. She was definitely the most prominent. And then for my generation in the late 70s, she was in a sitcom called Mind Your Language. So if I tell you it's a British sitcom made by ITV about an English language school where all the students represent different foreign stereotypes, you can imagine exactly what's that like, what that would be like.
Here's the Wikipedia quote. She was obliged to speak in an exaggerated, stereotyped Chinese accent.
Yeah. And it's another one of those shows, a bit like Love Thy Neighbour, where the writers have got very good intentions. They want it to be multicultural and to show that all these foreigners who are coming over here, they're all quite benign and they're very friendly. But it comes across as patronising, and the audience aren't laughing with them, they're laughing at them. So it's very much a misstep.
And it was the way that American television worked, too, until very, very, very recently. I was telling my daughter the story, and she can't believe it. When the Winter Olympics are played in Seoul in the year 2018, NBC, they have the Olympics contract, and they shunt a lot of the events onto pay cable stations or onto the web. But they do have a main strand for several hours every day on the over-the-air network, NBC, Channel 4 in New York. They needed to send an expert on Korean culture to Seoul to explain things to the American audience sitting in the booth alongside the sports play-by-play commentators. They sent a white guy who, as the Japanese team is marching through the opening ceremonies, the white guy starts waxing rhapsodic about what wonderful things the Japanese invasion of Korea did for Korean culture. The backlash was instant and fierce, and that commentator was sent home the very next day, begging the question, why in the year 2018, which is 5 years ago, why did NBC think the expert they needed to hire to explain Korean culture was a white guy? It's this weird default mentality that is finally in its death throes, but it just boggles the mind that this was actually somebody's highly paid train of thought was, we need an expert on Korean culture. Get me the nearest white guy.
Well, that's just the default position, isn't it? As you say, it's hey, Pete in accounts, he's got a friend who knows a guy. He knows something about Korea. Really, what does he know? Well, he's watched every episode of MASH, so that's about as much as he knows.
Let's take a sidestep for a bit. I have been doing this strand as we approach the 60th anniversary. Your favorite Doctor Who story of all time. Two things have not happened. Number one, nobody that I've asked has listed a new series story as their favorite. I also have not had it the case where the person telling me what their favorite story is happens to have as their favorite story the story being discussed that very week. I'm not positive that you're going to break either one of those trends, but I want to ask you, Jim Sangster, your favorite Doctor Who serial of all time, 1963 to 2022.
Yeah, I've heard you asking this of other people, and I thought, how am I going to answer this? And frankly, it's not like someone's going to put a gun to my head if I say an answer now and then contradict it in the future. So it doesn't matter. I'm just going to pick The Dalek Invasion of Earth. It's a story that I've seen in various different forms. Obviously, I saw the movie first. When I first got to know fans who had copies of things that I would never have seen, this one fan turned up one day with me and my friend and said, I've got 2 tapes. You can watch Dalek Invasion of Earth or The Chase. And I lobbied for The Chase because I'd already seen Dalek Invasion of Earth with Peter Cushing, so I knew the story, whereas The Chase would be a new thing. And I do still love The Chase, and I will defend it. But when I finally got to see Dalek Invasion of Earth, I was blown away because I hadn't seen a lot of Hartnell. And I certainly hadn't seen one of those stories where it feels like it takes weeks. It feels like we're almost watching it in real time, like over 6 weeks. That's how long it takes for them to walk to Bedford or whatever and escape London. And I just love the fact that the relationship with Susan and David grows over time. We see the Doctor observing it growing and recognizes how important it is. I've still got this little idea in my head that one day someone will pay me to write a prequel series to Dalek Invasion of Earth. And because I'm incredibly stupid, I've already plotted it in my head. So I love Dalek Invasion of Earth. But if it was a modern series, just to mess things up, I'm looking forward to the new episodes with David and Catherine because, if I'm honest, I've been grieving for Donna since she stopped being a proper companion. So The Stolen Earth would be my pick for the best of modern Who, because I love Catherine Tate so much, and when Donna was written out, I haven't really enjoyed Doctor Who as much since.
Catherine Tate probably far and away gives the best performance of any non-Doctor series regular in the entirety of the new series. And I didn't appreciate that when she was on the show, but you can bet I certainly appreciate it now. In terms of Dalek Invasion of Earth, I've mentioned this several times before. This was my first Hartnell story, my very first Doctor Who convention, July 1985. By the way, a date that is contemporaneous to the paperback release of the Mind of Evil novelization, which happens July 11th, 1985, not even 3 weeks before my first convention. But at that first convention, they screened the movie format of Dalek Invasion of Earth, cliffhangers edited out. Unlike you, I have actually done my top 60 list, number 60 all the way through number 1. Dalek Invasion of Earth is number 44. Now, that's not to say that it's low down on the top 60 list, but that's because I'm covering 60 years. They can't all be number 1. Just being on the top 60 list is a major achievement. So Dalek Invasion of Earth, there's reasons why it's 44 and not 24 or 4 or 1. But I am with you there in spirit. I think it is definitely high up in the conversation for greatest Doctor Who of all time. And the fact that it is now 60 years old, literally, and it's still one of the greatest Doctor Who's of all time is a stunning achievement.
It underlines the difference between favourite and best. Genesis of the Daleks, Talons Wen Chai and Caves of Androzani, they might be the best. They might be the ones we go, there you go. But it is entirely legitimate to say my favourite story is The Dominators or Love and Monsters or anything like that, because favourite is Love is Blind. It's a shame that I wasn't going to pick Mind of Evil. I do love Mind of Evil, but no, you're not going to get. I'm going to strike out again. I'm not going to pick my favourite of all time as a modern series, and I'm not going to pick the one we're talking about.
Mind of Evil is not on my top 60, but I'll tell you why. The reason why I picked my top 60 is I had to have some stories stand in for others. I couldn't have every single Hartnell historical in my top 60. I couldn't have every Season 8 Roger Delgado Master story in my top 60. Some stories are there specifically to speak for others. So I might have one story to represent a particular subgenre. There are other stories in that same subgenre that could be on the list, but I was trying to make it as representative and as broad as possible. Because I already had Don Houghton's other story in my top 60, Mind of Evil unfortunately had to stay in the bubbling underlist and is not in my top 60 that much.
I actually have done my preference. I did the Who preference sorting when that went round and there was that preference sort website. And I'm just looking here and I've divided them in stories that get 10 and then stories that get 9 and then working my way down. And yeah, Dalek Invasion of Earth, Robots of Death, Stolen Earth, Five Doctors, Terror of the Zygons, Towns of Weng-Chiang, Genesis of the Daleks. They're the stories for me that get 10.
Wow.
And as ever, when you do something like this and you go, hold on, where's the Satan Pit? So where's Ark in Space? And I'm trying to work out where's Mind of Evil in this. Mind of Evil, I don't think is in my top 60.
Oh, no.
Oh, no. Undermining everything I'm hopefully about to say at some point. Yeah. Mind of Evil is not in my top 60. I'm shocked. That's what this preference thing is such a kick in the guts when you start doing it, because you think, here's my beloved story and I watch it all the time. And then when you're sorting it through and it goes, no, you don't like it as much as you think, do you?
But yeah, this is always up for debate. There's always room to change. But Jim, I want to talk about 3 more things with you before we end the recording. Number 1, we're talking about Pix and Lim. We're talking about the Don Houghtonverse. We're talking about you writing a fandom prequel to Dalek Invasion of Earth. Isn't there a project that you are involved in right now which involves revisiting the Houghtonverse as a professional commission?
There is. It's very strange. Last year, after I finished doing my blog and I wasn't ready to let go of Target, so I just asked on Twitter, of the original batch of Chris Achilleus illustrated or covered books, which do you wish had had illustrations? And then I got a nice little pool of suggestions. And then I just started illustrating those books just for fun and then putting the images up on Twitter. So I did Ark in Space, Web of Fear, The Three Doctors, and just started working my way through. I did Dalek Invasion of Earth because I wanted to do that. And then I've had 2 separate approaches in the last month, one of which I, as the saying goes, can't talk about right now. But the other one, thanks to Gary Russell, there is a Kickstarter that was launched a while ago by Cutaway Comics for a graphic novel prequel to Inferno. And it's going to be written by Gary Russell and illustrated by John Ridgway. And that was already exciting enough. And then the publisher, Gareth Kavanagh, said that they're planning to do a stretch goal. So if they get enough subscribers for this thing, Gary will write a novella, which will be a prequel to The Mind of Evil, which is about a survey team who discover the parasite. And would I like to illustrate that in the style of a Target book? I said yes very quickly. And then I said to Gary, so send me your book and I can start work on it. He said, it's a Kickstarter. I haven't started writing it yet. So last week, as the Kickstarter was running out of time, was a very tense time for me. And then I think it was due to finish at 11:30 our time. And at 11 o'clock, it just passed the threshold for this part of the Kickstarter to come through. My neighbours heard me cheering. So hopefully once Gary's finished writing it, I'll be able to start work maybe over Christmas, and I'll be making sure that depending on who the characters are, I might be sneaking in some familiar faces into the guest cast in some way. So I'll see what I can do there. God, you said that we've only got like a little bit of time. I've got all these notes of all these things that I was going to mention, and we've been waffling a lot. But
I have added as a link in the show notes. I'm not from England. I've spent exactly 9 days of my life there. I know the basics, but there's a lot that I don't know. And then there's stuff that I read in 1985, 86, 87 as a young Target reader that went in one eyeball and out the other. As I picked up the Mind of Evil novelization again for the first time in many years, there's a prominent reference on page 1 to the Tyburn tree. At age 50, even if I've heard about it before, I had no recollection of it in my active memory. So I go, what is the Tyburn tree? In my head was a picture of a very large, very broad oak tree, centuries old, with many strong branches. I immediately went to YouTube and I found a 6-minute video from somebody who calls himself the History Lord, who walks around London and taking video from famous monuments. And I will be adding a link to that he has a very good discussion of the Tyburn tree, and he gives two historical facts, both of which are apocryphal and not true, about the origin of the expression hangover and about the origin of the expression one for the road. But it's an entertaining video, and I'm going to link to it anyway. But why don't you give us the actual discussion? What is the Tyburn tree, or what was the Tyburn tree?
Beautiful thing. I mean, this is, again, Terence has been accused of phoning it in a lot over the last, this period of time. But this is the point where, because they're not using them as often, he's got the space to actually put some effort in. And on the very first page, he throws in a cultural reference to the Tyburn tree to remind us that only a decade or so before this story was broadcast, the criminals on this wing might have been on death row awaiting execution. So he starts off with they're reacting to this process, the Keller machine process, as if it's a death. The Tyburn tree wasn't a tree. It was public gallows that were located near where Marble Arch is today. There were various gallows there in that location for about 500 years until the mid-18th century. And prisoners would be led from Newgate Prison out east in the City of London. And then the route would be from east to west, starting where the Old Bailey is now, up to Holborn, where they could do some nice location spotting for the Web of Fear.
Mm-hmm.
Then onto a pub next to St Giles's Church, where they'd have a final drink, which I think is where all the apocryphal stories of hangover and one for the road come from. And that St Giles's Church is in the shadow of the huge Centre Point office block on the corner of Tottenham Court Road. And then they begin the final stretch along the Tyburn Road, which is now Oxford Street, which is the main thoroughfare of shops through central London. And that takes about 20 minutes to walk along, allowing time for traffic lights and pedestrians with no sense of urgency, until eventually they get to Marble Arch, realise that Marble Arch hasn't been built yet, and instead see the gallows, which was the Tyburn tree. And they'd also see the crowds, because it was a public event. Nowadays, we do something similar. It's called Channel 5 in the UK.
Any other points about Mind of Evil that you want to hit before we get to the games portion of the recording?
So my friend Craig Williams recently guested on Joe's Hamster with a Blunt Penknife. It was his first ever podcast, which sickens me because he was absolutely amazing. And I don't want to spoil any of his jokes, but one of the things he pointed out is that the Doctor is from a technologically advanced race, but he seems to be really excited that they've got CCTV at the prison. He's so excited. But it's also a cultural reference. So he's quoting from Candid Camera when he goes, "Smile, Joe, you're on camera." And then Joe's also dropping the reference to Dracula's castle. And it's a nice way of setting up the cultural references to say, we're in the now. It gives it a sense of reality before things get weird. And as I mentioned earlier, it is one of those stories where fans like to convince themselves it's all gritty and realistic. But one of the things that really grounds it is Nick Courtney. Even though he's the comic fool in a lot of this stuff, like he's the one who goes, when the Doctor says, "Are you speaking Hokkien?" No, it's Chinese, Doctor. So he gets to do the rather clumsy joke, but he is grounding every scene he's in. He's selling the urgency. Even the fact that you've got this really obnoxious Chinese delegate who's been really rude and over-demanding, and you can see him wanting to say, "How dare you, shut up," and he loses his temper for a second and then reins it back in because he realizes the stakes are too high to throw a tantrum. And he's, this, I mentioned before, this has got a great cast. It's got Michael Sheard in it. It's the second of his 6 appearances. And I think this is one of his best.
And it's the last one without facial hair.
Also, the last one with some hair on his head as well. The visible shock when he's told about the death of Kettering, and it feels really authentic. Again, there's that word. It's a huge step away from the more melodramatic parts that he becomes famous for. In the UK, he was famous for playing Mr. Bronson, an unreasonably stern French teacher in the children's drama Grange Hill. I met Michael Sheard in 2003. My late friend Paul was DJing at the Panopticon convention that year, and I was his assistant. So I was helping him select records, and I was sorting out his CDs. Paul had successfully battered away lots of drunken requests for, "Can I do karaoke?" And he just went, "I don't have that kind of entertainment license," and got rid of them. And then Michael Sheard came over to ask if he could do his party piece. and he asked for a particular record, which we didn't have. And then 10 minutes later, he bounded over. I've managed to procure a CD. So Paul paused his DJ set and played the record, and that's how we witnessed Michael Sheard take the stage and shout along to Alice Cooper's School's Out.
Oh, wow.
It was shambolic and very energetic. And afterwards, he came back and gave us copies of his excellent autobiography, and he was utterly charming.
Oh, wow.
There's my little name drop moment for the thing. Just one other thing. I've always said Don Houghton. And I was speaking to Gary Russell this week, and he has always said Don Houghton, completely ignoring the fact that I've got two really good friends who pronounce it Houghton. And so I went back through the archives to look at as many interviews with people who knew him. And Terence Dix calls him Houghton. Barry Letts calls him Houghton. And literally 2 days ago, I had to do a mental switch and go, I think it might be Houghton. I don't know. But I've always called him Don Houghton. I've always called him Houghton.
I try to take care of pronunciations on this show. One of the reasons why I went to YouTube to watch videos of the Tyburn tree was to make sure that it was actually pronounced Tyburn and not Tyburn. With some of these authors, even to this day, there are rival pronunciations for Mark Gatiss and Eric Sayward. The reason why my mind defaults to Houghton is because it rhymes with Troughton, which has the same spelling structure. I would have thought that the alternate would have been Houghton, but when I hear Houghton, I think Horton, Horton.
Yeah.
So, fortunately, I have not yet recorded the audio essay for this episode, but I have already recorded and released the audio essay for Inferno, where I said Houghton. So that will have to remain forever a blooper, and I will change it to Houghton for this episode.
It's easy to remember. Just remember Horton Hears a Who.
But that's spelled Horton, at least in the United
just
States.
Details. That's just details. And I was thinking about, I was chatting to a friend yesterday about this story, and I said, it feels as if this Keller process has been government sanctioned. And he was saying, no, it's self-selecting the prisons who want to use it. So maybe I'm wrong on this, but in the UK, well, most of the UK, the death penalty was suspended in 1965 before becoming a permanent suspension in 1969. But it wasn't officially completely abolished until 1998 in the UK. So there were still some crimes that you could be executed for, even though nobody was. Like treason was one of them. In the time of the Tyburn tree, you could be executed for stealing. So it's quite a serious thing. But I was thinking about this new process. It's been installed. It's been around for about a year, and they've done specifically 113 of these processes by the beginning of the story, which makes it feel like it's officially sanctioned by the Home Office in the UK, which means that there must have been a vote in the House of Commons. Maybe the master just went round all the pubs in Westminster, dressed as a waiter, served all of the MPs their lunches with brandy the day of the vote, and whispered, "You will obey me," to swing the vote. I mean, the other thing about, we're talking about the gritty realism of this show. And another thing that my mate Craig pointed out in the Hamster podcast, in the show, we never really find out what Barnum did, what any of them did. And post-conversion, Joe treats Barnum like a friendly but simple child. But considering this is supposed to be an alternative to the death penalty, he must have done something really bad. I won't spoil Craig's speculation from the Hamster podcast because it made me choke on my own spit with laughter, but it's horrific when you begin to speculate. Luckily, Uncle Terence doesn't want us to have nightmares, so he tells us what Barnum got up to. He tells us what Mailer also did. So that's a lovely little addition. And all the way through, he's looking at the story going, what don't we know about these people that might be useful? Things like Kettering. He panics because he starts fantasizing, or he starts imagining that he's seeing water. In the book, he's not hallucinating water. The room is flooding with water, reminding him of a childhood trauma where he nearly drowned in a boating accident.
And I'll jump in with some quick casting notes. Neil McCarthy later plays the bad guy in Power of Kroll, which is not quite as beloved as Mind of Evil, but has its supporters. And he also played Calibos in the film version of Clash of the Titans, a Ray Harryhausen picture. And my name comes from another Ray Harryhausen picture. Father was a big sci-fi fan, so I am literally named for a Ray Harryhausen movie. So Clash of the Titans was very big with me growing up. I had the comic book adaptation, and I would have been looking at illustrated pictures of Neil McCarthy in the comic book adaptation. And then William Marlowe, who has a major role in the back half of the story, later has a more minor but heroic role and a very funny role in Revenge of the Cybermen, my first Cyberman story. So not just Michael Shear, this is an all-star cast across the board.
And of course, people often allude to who William Marlowe later married. I mean, he was married 3 times, and his second wife was Catherine Schell. They split up just before City of Death. And actually, Kismet Delgado, they don't get together until 1983, so it's quite a long time after Roger's death. It's not like he's sort of rubbing his knees with glee if Roger's wife comes in to the recording studio or whatever. You know, it's not like that at all. But they knew each other for quite a while, I would imagine.
Catherine Schell was supposed to be at L.I. Who back in August, 2 months ago as I record this. Unfortunately, she had to be a late cancellation. I was looking forward to meeting her. And she was also in On Her Majesty's Secret Service as one of the Bond girls at the chateau.
Along with a future Doctor Who.
Joanna Lumley.
Yep.
See, I got that one. All right, well, we are reaching the upper end of my audience's patience for episode lengths between this and my intro and the Direction Point trailers and the audio essay that I have not finished writing yet. So let's jump ahead and play a game. Jim, I want to challenge you to the hardest and the newest game that I have to offer, which is Guess the Quote. You are going to name the story that the quote comes from, and for bonus points, you are going to name the speaker. I can see you hanging your head in shame as if the Tyburn tree is coming up in the distance.
I've got to say, I don't have a brain for remembering quotes. I struggle with it at school. Even though I can sing, I can't remember lyrics unless they're written in front of me. The only things I can actually quote extensively are, embarrassingly, Trial of a Time Lord and the film versions of Educating Rita and Shirley Valentine. So I don't remember any Shakespeare, but I remember Willie Russell really well. So in the context of your game, this is literally my worst nightmare.
Well, like Professor Kettering, in a dry room, let us play quote number 1. It's an accepted thing, isn't it? Almost a tradition, in fact, that the family of Caesar want to murder each other. After all, everybody would like to be Caesar of Rome, wouldn't they? I wonder who will have the honor of being given this. And then the performer holds up a bubbling vial.
I mean, I'd assume that that's the Romans.
You would assume correctly.
Okay, well, okay. So I'm not gonna strike out. I hope you appreciate the amount of baseball references I've been casually thrown into this.
You are hitting a home run with the audience.
I know this is really a baseball podcast, so.
That segues nicely into our second quote. And again, these are all classic series stories for the time being because the new series quotes are too ubiquitous and annoying. You approach lèse majesté when you put the soul into the past tense.
What?
I'll say that again. You approach lèse majesté when you put the soul into the past tense. That is delivered by the bad guy of the story speaking to one of his underlings.
I mean, with this, I'm going to say Mind of Evil just because of soul.
Very close. You're only off by a dozen years and 2 doctors. It is, in fact, For a Doomsday Monarch.
Oh, I'm entirely happy not being able to remember any of the dialogue from that because it is rotten.
That's one of the best lines in the story because
It's one of the few that's not racist, so that's quite good.
oh my goodness. No, Monarch is still in the flesh time, but all of his underlings are androids.
Oh,
And
of
one
course.
of the ministers, I think Enlightenment, starts referring to soul as a bad thing. And of course, Monarch still has one, so he starts complaining. This one is pretty obvious as a dead giveaway. Are you ready for number 3?
Yeah, go on.
Number 3. That picture can't be the moon. The moon's way up in the sky.
Oh, is this Jamie? Is this the moon base?
It is Jamie, and it is the moon base.
Well, I survived that. That was good news.
I will say that when I came up with the moon base part 1 in my random episode generator, I was looking for an easy, obvious dead giveaway. Whereas for to Doomsday part 2, I just picked a quote that I enjoyed.
There's a lovely drinking game you can play in the Pertwee era, which I like to call There's Dave Carter. So he plays a couple of roles in season 7 where it's difficult to tell it's him, but like he's a Silurian, he's a Primord. I think he's a victim of the Silurian plague at one point. And then he pops up as the security guy in the Science Museum who gets coshed in Terror of the Autons. And then in this, you see him all the way through as a prison warder. So you can get yourself absolutely steaming if you want to drink along with every single time you see Dave Carter on screen. And then while we're thinking of supporting actors, I just want to do a bit of a sort of a crowbarred headcanon thing. There's another female other than Jo in the Keller Machine demonstration room. She's right at the back. She's played by an actress called Maureen Race, who I can't really find much about apart from the fact that she graduated from RADA. But looking at the haircut and the glasses, with just a little bit of imagination, I think you can headcanon her character as Hilda Winters from Robot. Because she looks very similar to... You can imagine her being a young student, Hilda Winters, and then a few years later she graduates to run some sort of organization who do lots of thinking and imagining and science and stuff.
A think tank, if you will.
A think tank, yes, that would be a great name for it. We should definitely write that down. And then when I'm thinking about that scene, actually, when Kettering's doing his presentation, the Doctor keeps chirping in, and he's incredibly rude and smug. He's a total arse all the way through it. And he claims to not know anything about the process. He's going there to discover it. But then all the way through, he's chipping in, and every single time Kettering says anything, he says to Jo, "That's not true. He's got that wrong." And he's utterly wrong, because regardless of the fact that it's actually a killer parasite, the process does actually work.
I'm just stuck on this Hilda Winters headcanon thing. It's almost as if somebody were to say, I don't know, write a prequel story to The Mind of Evil, or if someone were to, I don't know, be commissioned professionally to illustrate the prequel to Mind of Evil, it's almost as if Patricia Maynard should show up in the story or the illustration as young Hilda, and this would be canonized forever in an officially funded, partially by Jason, Kickstarter project. If only you had the power and the influence to do such a thing.
Oh dear, yeah, that'd be lovely, wouldn't it? I've got this one. It's my other joke. So if you just want to crowbar this in, and then I'll leave you alone. So, we're talking about the authentic Chinese characters. When Chin Lee reveals that there's going to be another Chinese delegate on the way, I'm surprised and kind of relieved that it's not actually Roger Delgado in makeup. Because you can picture the scene, can't you? "Surely did some basic Chinese at school, Jo. Shang Wo is Cantonese for master." But instead, thankfully, we just get him playing another shady telephone operator in a badly fitting mask, actually messing around in the same square that the Doctor trapped the war machine in a few years earlier, Cornwall Gardens.
Jo, did you fail Mandarin as well as science?
Yeah. And then we find out he's also the mysterious Emil Keller. And you can picture the scene, can't you? "Surely you did some basic German at school, Jo. Keller is German for... cellar. My mistake, as you were. Never mind."
the late lamented Craig Hinton when he wrote the novel The Quantum Archangel, which, by the way, is almost a direct influence on Day of the Doctor. I believe the master was using the Serbian word for master as his pseudonym or nom de guerre in that particular novel.
The late lamented Craig Hinton. He was a great drinking buddy many years ago. Yeah.
I do have to ask, Jim, I thank you very much for taking the time to record with me. This is one of our best recording sessions ever. I'm very excited to put this out into the world. But I noticed several grimaces of pain on your face as we were playing that overly challenging Guess the Quote game. What would you say the state of your brain is right now after 3 rounds of Guess the Quote?
It's particularly scrambled. I don't know if I'm going to be able to cope with the rest of the day. So, what's that noise? What's that? What's that? No! No!
Doctor Who, The Mind of Evil, by Terrance Dicks, televised as The Mind of Evil, teleplay by Don Houghton, televised in January 1971 through March 1971, paperback release date July 11th, 1985, target book number 96, cover artist Andrew Skilleter. Eminent scientist Emil Keller has developed a revolutionary new process for the treatment of hardened criminals. His invention, the Keller machine, is being heralded as a major scientific breakthrough. But Professor Keller is in truth the master, and the Keller machine is much more than a mere machine. Soon, the Doctor is involved in a bitter struggle with his deadliest enemy, an alien mind parasite, and a diabolical scheme to plunge the world into a third world war. Oh, this is a big moment for Doctor Who literature. This book, Mind of Evil, is in some ways one of the most important Jon Pertwee episode novelizations. And that's some pretty prestigious company, remembering that the target line proper began with 6 straight Pertwee adaptations between January 1974 through October 1974, episodes 4 through 9 of this podcast. But that was different. 1974 was still when Jon Pertwee was the TV Doctor. Those 6 books, as rich and epic as they were merely adaptations of what was happening on TV in your young life. Stories you already recalled watching on TV, most likely. The Doctor of the moment. But what happens in the moment never stays in the moment. Years pass, civilizations rise, wheel turns, civilizations fall. You know how it goes. The Mara laughs as a decade lapses. The Doctor turns over 3 times. By the Mind of Evil hits the shelves. Colin Baker's already been hired. Filmed a season. The show's been cancelled. Doctor in Distress has been out for months. Nearly bankrupted Ian Levine and nearly ended Hans Zimmer's career before it even started. By July 1985, the month of my first Doctor Who convention, as I recounted back in episode 17 of this podcast, my 3 Doctors episodes, Pertwee novelizations were rare. After November 1980's The Monster of Peladon, the only other Pertwee book was Inferno. Most of the era has already been written. Only 2 books are left after this one comes out. But now Pertwee can reach a new era of fandom. Those like me, too young, or too American, to recall Jon Pertwee as the star on television. Aware of the Brigadier, of course, from his 2 recent TV appearances, but for whom Joe Grant and Sergeant Benton are only names on a page. And it's been over 8 years, since the last time a Roger Delgado episode was novelized. April 1977's The Claws of Axos, episode 31 of this podcast. So What the Mind of Evil is one of those stone-cold Jon Pertwee classics. Great outings for Pertwee and Joe, the Unit family, the Havoc stunt team, Dudley Simpson's unit theme, which you hear at the end of every episode of this show, and of course the man himself, Roger Delgado. And if you're a baby fan in July 1985, as was your boy Jason, well, this book is an eye-opener, your first step into a larger world. Of course, I will admit it took a minute for me to realize how awesome The Mind of Evil is. When I first started taping Doctor Who off-air on VHS at age 16, once I finally had a job and could buy my own tapes without relying on my mother's allowance, I labeled my tapes Best of Doctor Who and did not save every Pertwee story. Minimum wage, you see, making only $4.25 an hour in the summer of 1990, I could only save the stories that I really loved. Mind of Evil was one of the ones I didn't save. But my COVID-19 lockdown Doctor Who marathon, courtesy of the superlative Season 8 Blu-rays, changed that opinion forever. The video has never looked as good as it does now. Watching no longer in the grainy black and white of my PBS childhood, or the patchy color of commercial VHS, Mind of Evil now looks as if it were shot yesterday. I will say it is not as good as Don Houghton's other Doctor Who effort, Inferno, which is high atop my top 60. For my money, Inferno is the greatest Doctor Who story of the show's first 7 seasons. Mind lacks the thematic tightness of Inferno, where almost every scene, every line of dialogue in the first 2 parts, takes on a dreadful significance in the middle fascist England episodes. But Mind does benefit from a layered story. We start off with the Doctor and Joe investigating a potentially sinister prison reform technique, and with the Brigadier playing reluctant cop at a peace conference. Unlike Inferno, told in neat narrative circles, Mind ends up exactly nowhere near where it started. Most of the episode 1 guest cast is long since dead by episode 6. As benefiting Doctor Who's serial format back in the 70s, each new episode adds layers atop the plot while gradually removing older ones. The Keller machine process is not simply an altruistic prison reform method, it's an alien mind parasite. And it doesn't just drain the evil out of men's minds, it can also torment them with their worst nightmares, or literally suck their brains dry and kill the victim. Professor Keller is not some benevolent Swiss criminologist, but actually the master. The peace conference isn't just a way for Don Houghton to write his wife into the script, but a way of exploring international mistrust. The American ambassador has a deathly fear of China, which manifests in his terror of a quilted pink dragon. Unit is disposing of a nuclear power nerve gas missile at the same time as the conference. Then there's an Attica-style prison takeover. The inmates want that missile. The master plot has to be spelled out to be believed. Let's break this down. He spends a year posing as Professor Keller and cures 113 hardened criminals. He seduces Captain Chin Lee into being his assistant, giving him access to Stangmore Prison and the peace conference at the same time. He visits the prison just after a failed breakout and manages to turn the inmates into a private army. The Thunderbolt just happens to be traveling by Stangmore, as you do, and the Master uses Mailer and the inmates to steal it in a trademark action by Havoc sequence with helicopters and motorcycles and a full-size missile. So the endgame of his Keller disguise was to steal a missile and use it to blackmail Europe. Anthony Ainley's Master got laughed at for overly complex plots, and do not get me started on Power of the Doctor. But Roger Delgado looks so good in that black suit and cigar on Rolls Royce, strolling into a prison with smoke bombs and gas masks in his briefcase, that you never question his plan. One of the many plot twists at the episode 4 cliffhanger, the Keller machine starts to teleport. This twist used to be derided on Reckard's Doctor Who in the 90s. I love it. The guest cast, excellent. Michael Sheard might not get to do much as Dr. Summers, but he is in every episode. Clearly has a crush on Joe Grant, although I guess, in some sense, so do we all. Oh, and did I mention Dr. Summers is played by Michael Sheard. The prison governor is played with wonderfully understated realism and even knows who the Doctor is. One can imagine a Season 7 Pertwee having long dinners with the governor at civil service retreats. Mailer is to this episode what Regan is to the Ambassadors of Death, a charismatic criminal that's easy to root for. Captain Chin Li does well in her small part, initially evil-seeming but ultimately sympathetic. The Chinese ambassador finds a kindred spirit in the Doctor, only his overly dramatic heavenly gaze as he says, "Chairman Mao," beggars belief. The weak spot is Barnum, the last survivor of the Keller machine. The script kills him off just after he's helped save the day, the mind parasite and the missile both consumed in the same explosion. Lazy writing. The script could have done better to tackle the ramifications of what it means to be a mind totally cured of evil in modern society, presenting Barnum as a sort of benign Superman who could change society. Instead, he's just run over by a truck when his plot utility runs out, which I'm sure the author thought was poignant, but I find more maddening than anything else. The regulars continue to excel, not that you need me to tell you that. Pertwee is wonderful in his many moods, goofily grinning at the Stangmore prison camera, going all Third Doctor on poor Professor Kettering, going face-to-face with the Master several times, verbal jousting, an actual fistfight, a negotiation in the last episode. The genuine warmth between these two men lights up every scene they're in together, the Doctor-Master chemistry that has rarely been rivaled. I would argue only Peter Capaldi and Michelle Gomez come close. The Walter Raleigh anecdote, as the Doctor lies ill in his prison cell, when we learn in episode 4 that the Master's biggest fear is the Doctor, Pertwee plays the projected image with manic glee. And as for Jo Grant, who got off to a rocky start in episode 1 of Terror of the Autons as written by Robert Holmes, here she literally single-handedly breaks up a prison riot. "Well, Governor, he's all yours," she says, not to mention her chemistry with Barnum or Dr. Summers. The Brigadier gets to put on a Cockney accent, and even Richard Franklin gets a win against Delgado in episode 5. "All right, Captain, you can stop pretending to be unconscious now." Benton's awkward delight, after a string of bumbles all story long, in being appointed acting prison governor, is another joy in a story full of joys. Again, the ending could be stronger. Apart from the Barnum problem, the peace conference subplot peters out after episode 3, and the prison riot ends with episode 5, meaning the first half of episode 6 is characters just sitting around saying, "Gee, now what?" That doesn't matter. I'm finally at the point where I love The Mind of Evil on TV as much as I love the novelization. And that's a lot of love.
感謝你請我來星星，我真歡喜拄着你真好心的人，都你無激動的國。It is rare to meet a Westerner who knows my language.
Well, thank you. Actually, I fear my Hokkien is somewhat rusty.
On the contrary, it is excellent.
Well, it's many years since I've had a chance to use it. Here. I remember once having a conversation with Setung.
Situng? But that is the personal name of our chairman, Mao Zedong.
He himself gave me leave to use it.
Yes, if we could just discuss the immediate problem.
You will take some tea.
Come here.
放茶來，星星。你聽到我中國人死在咧國台，這是真大代志。
是，沒聽到。
你哋去香港搞來講話。
Now, in terms of the novelization, this is not going to be one of my usual page-by-page read-through essays because of the book's emotional place in my heart. I want to talk about how this book makes me feel, rather than what the words on the page say. In publication order, in my personal collection order, this was the last Target novelization that I would act out in my living room, because by this point I was still getting 4 to 6 Targets a month as babysitting wages, and was no longer finishing each book within hours of purchase. Now, I had a backlog, and I was also getting older, and less likely to want to pretend to be Mike Yates shamming unconsciousness. This book arrived late in my first giddy phase of Who fandom, but it's the fulcrum on which my love of the show pivots, from my childhood adoration for any Tom Baker or Peter Davison episode that I'd see on PBS, to what my fandom is in 2023. A real appreciation of John and Katie and Roger, now for me, 3 of the greatest figures in the show history. And we're also out the other side of Terrence Dicks's micro-book era, books like Destiny of the Daleks or Robots of Death, which barely cleared 100 pages of text. This one is back to 138 pages, running from pages 7 through 144 in the Target style. It's about as rich and dense as his earliest Pertwee and Tom Baker books, what used to be his standard page length up until the year 1977. So Terrence has a lot of space to lavish on Don Houghton's layered six-part story, and if one more person tells me that Mind of Evil or any other Pertwee serial is 2 episodes too long, so help me, I'm going to have to take very drastic measures, like asking you to stop. Okay, I'm going to cheat, and I will do a read-through of the first chapter for you. The first page is one of those Terrence delights, repeated phrases, an atmosphere of grim foreboding, and a history lesson. I can't read you the whole book, but I can read you this one page, page 7. Chapter 1, The Sentence. The prisoners always knew when sentence was to be carried out. They had known in the savage days, when the condemned man was paraded in state to Tyburn Tree, there to meet his fate before a cheering, roaring mob of bloodthirsty spectators. They had known in the latter, relatively more civilized years, when dazed, pale-faced men were marched across the prison yard to the execution shed to end their lives before prison governor, chaplain, and a few grim-faced warders. And they knew today. Tyburn Tree and the silent scaffold were things of the past, but still, somewhere in the prison, one of their number waited in the condemned cell, waited for the sound of marching footsteps in the corridor and the flinging open of the cell door. The prisoners knew, and they reacted as they had always reacted, muttering and cursing and shouting, and rattling tin cups and plates against the bars of their cells. As the hour when sentence was to be executed drew closer, the sound rose in volume and intensity, like the mindless shriek of some great beast. Sentence was about to be carried out on George Patrick Barnum, and his fellow prisoners were paying him the traditional tribute. Once the scripts get adapted proper, starting on page 8, Terrence has clearly what was then the surviving black and white films, accurately identifying the shape of the road leading up to Stangmore Prison, and what Katie and John were wearing for director Tim Coombe on location. Terrence has time to slip in observational humor. Page 8. Despite his status as a new member of a top-secret organization, the doctor hated carrying passes, papers, and identification permits, and usually left that side of thing to Jo. She sometimes thought that a large part of her job was to stop the doctor from getting arrested for poking his nose into places where he had no official business. Terrence doesn't describe everyone's face. The prison guards get names only, but his triptych description of the prison governor, and Simon Lack's character, and Michael Sheard on page 10 is his usual razor-sharp economy. Dr. Summers wears, quote, white coat, the thinning hair, and a permanently worried expression. You tried describing Michael Sheard better in just 10 words. And the book's 1985 provenance is briefly betrayed on page 12 by the anachronistic description of a VCR player. Chapter 2 does, spoiler alert, continue on in this vein. We get a brief, possibly coded, description of Captain Yates and his thin, sensitive-looking face, but being a good deal tougher than he looked. We don't get a physical description of the Brigadier, but his phone call with the minister, described as, quote, politely mutinous, is awesome. But, never minding the page-by-page text, how did I interact with this book as a kid? When I first bought it, like I said, I had a backlog, so I read Chapter 1 only, and then shelved it. And then a few days later, I read Chapter 1 again. And a few days after that, Chapter 1 a third time. I would do the same thing with Fury from the Deep, which is coming up soon on this show. And then when I finally did finish Mind of Evil, it was, as I've said, the last of the books that I would act out around the home when I was alone. I would be Captain Yates, shamming unconsciousness. I would jump on the couch as unit soldiers rappelled up the walls of Stangmore Prison. I'd throw myself to the ground, a la Barnum getting killed by a truck on the third-to-last page. And while I've never had a great ear for accents or impersonations, excepting my spectacular Sean Connery impersonation, I spent a lot of time John Pertweeing that last page. Page 144. So the master had found the circuit after all, thought the doctor. He did his best to put a brave face on it. "I hope that means we've seen the last of you." The master's voice vibrated with anger. "For some little time, Doctor, but rest assured, one day I shall destroy this miserable planet, and you with it." The master laughed. "Goodbye, Doctor." He paused. "Oh, and Doctor, enjoy your exile." The doctor slammed down the phone, cutting off the sound of the master's mocking laughter. "What did he say?" asked Joe. "Oh, the usual threats." "Never mind, Doctor," said Joe consolingly. "You've beaten him." "Have I? His TARDIS is working again. He can go anywhere he pleases. And I'm trapped on Earth," said the doctor accusingly. "With you, Brigadier." Now, the Mind of Evil novelization is in many ways a transcript of the TV episodes. The scenes occur almost entirely in their TV order, and the book dialogue is probably at least 98% of what we got on television. But Terrence, as he always does, and you can listen to just about any other Terrence-themed episode of this podcast ever to hear me say the same thing, adds tons of value in the margins, adding his insights and opinions and thoughts on nearly every page. There are the flashbacks to Inferno. Sergeant Benton was being James Bond. The master slid gracefully into the back seat, sank back into the expensive leather upholstery, and produced and lit a large and opulent cigar. Senator Alcott had been fighting communism all his life. The doctor had sunk back into his coma, the coma that seemed to Joe very close to death. Barnum stopped to help. It was a fatal mistake. Why did I act out this story in my house on the eve of being a teenager? Because reading this book is literally like watching television. Terrence describes the visuals in crystal clear detail, but his connecting prose, which I've sampled above, tells you the characters' inner lives, their private thoughts and feelings, their body language. There are over 150 Target books, of varying lengths, prose styles, and complexity, but this is the book that, even more so than Inferno, turned the Pertwee era from just one of the Doctor's past lives into legend, such that, as James Courray Smith recently argued persuasively on his Substack, to the extent that by the early 1990s, John Pertwee was the current Doctor again. The novelization of The Mind of Evil encapsulates what was so perfect about that era. So much so that you can literally see the visuals while reading the book. I'm 50 now. I can't really rappel up couches or throw myself on the floor anymore a la George Barnum, so I couldn't act out the book while reading it this week. But I could, while reading the pages, see myself doing the same thing at age 12. Were I to be confronted with the Keller machine, what would be my biggest fear? Losing my copy of this book.
Thank you, Brigadier. But do you think for once in your life you could manage to arrive before the nick of time?
I'm glad to see you too, Doctor. All right, Miss Grant?
Yes, thanks.
I see you've changed your job.
Yes, rather an effective disguise, don't you think?
Right, Doctor.
Well, did you get the master?
Sorry, sir. He seems to have got away.
What about the missile?
Oh, we didn't.
Isn't it here?
No.
Oh.
Apart from losing the master and the missile, you're doing very well, Brigadier.
Next time on Doctor Who Literature, we are going back once more to the 1960s, to my beloved William Hartnell era. We are going to welcome to the Target novelization range one Donald Cotton for the first of his 3 books. It is the novelization of his first TV historical, Season 3's first story up in its turbulent and traumatizing production order, The Mythmakers. We're going back to the time of the Trojan War. We're going back to an episode that was discussed with my guest Ian Potter on a recent bonus episode, and we are now going to be addressing the novelization, which has some similarities and some pretty significant differences from the TV serial. My guest is going to be the great Cy Hart, one of the most frequent contributors to this program, and we're going to break down everything about the Mythmakers, from its lost TV visuals, to the surviving soundtrack, to the lovely bright yellow color scheme and dematerializing TARDIS shape of the novelization's paperback design. We are going to discuss the First Doctor, then Stephen, then Vicky, than Katerina, than all the Greek heroes of old. Next week, Doctor Who, The Mythmakers by Donald Cotton. Thank you for joining me on another episode of the Doctor Who Literature Podcast. This podcast is produced by David Barsky, Jim Sangster, and yours truly. This week's episode was written by myself and Jim Sangster, and was edited by me. Our logo was designed by, say it again, Jim Sangster. Special thanks to my special guest, well, you know who. This podcast can be found on most of your podcast apps of choice. You can find all past episodes at podcasters.spotify.com/pod/show/Doctor Who Lit. It really helps if you rate 5 stars and subscribe. You can find me on Blue Sky and Mastodon on Twitter as Doctor Who Novels. That's Dr. Who Novels, although hopefully not Twitter for too much longer. You can also find me on email at Doctor Who Literature. That's drwholiterature@gmail.com. Please drop me a line with your comments, questions, and suggestions. Thank you for listening, and whatever you do, keep turning the pages.
Direction point! Direction point!
A Doctor Who podcast network.